that he talks about direct democracy or representative democracy, and how things can dramatically change when we move from a government that is based on representatives that are separated from the people. And that act of he mentions a paragraph of Rousseau when he says, well, the British people feel that they are free, but they are only free at the moment they go to vote, and then they are slaves again. That's the only moment of freedom that they have. They go to vote, they elect members for the parliament, and then they go back to slavery. And so that's a very, and he tries to elaborate on the complications, on the complexity of our modern world, and basically the impossibility of having a direct democracy, right. A direct, and he talks about having the difference between having a government that requires a political system, or a system that has a sort of an administration that is not it's not based on a political system, and those two, for me, are very relevant to today's conflicts in the world, where we, as Westerners, we think that our democracy is the best and possible form of civilization. And in my view, there are others that are more administrative and less political than our so-called democracy, that once you voted, your rights disappear immediately.
Yeah, that really struck me too, Mario, and I made a bunch of notes about that. I mean, that statement, that Rousseau statement, was like, wow, that's heavy. That's a really strong statement about slavery, but it's interesting because it really resonated with my own thinking lately, which is, my God, people look and act like slaves here in this country. Yeah. In this country.
Yeah.
And enslaved to the economy, to the need to work so many hours, to the need to pay for all this stuff that maybe lots of it isn't really needed. Yeah. And then there was this connection that you were alluding to also, that between the direct democracy and representatives. So we really give away our power to other people, and the way the system is set up, which I never heard anybody talk about this before. So this was very enlightening to me. Yeah, we give away our power, and then we've really have this systematic psychological program that we've all internalized, that I can't do that. I can't participate in decision making for everyone. I'm not up to that. I don't have the training. I don't have the time. I don't have that. Whatever it is, we're completely disempowered to believe that we have to elect certain people. And so oftentimes our lawmakers, our lawyers, who are incredibly skilled at manipulation.
Yeah.
Manipulation of information. And so therefore, is this a true, it's not even a true representation. We've given it away. And now we're wondering why we're so frustrated and nobody's representing us. How do we take this back? And just so for myself, what I saw him hinting at in this chapter was he started to talk about the guilds and the assemblies and the local councils that exist in different parts of the world and did in organic society. And that seems to be maybe our hope of how we begin to take back our governance, like become self-governing. The only way to do it is to start with a small local group and begin to, and there are movements in our country and globally in the Western world for local autonomy, neighborhood groups. Now states are enacting laws, for instance, cannabis laws. That's completely coming from the local, not from the federal government, but it's rising up from the people. All this diversity is finding, wow, there's more and more people who want this to not be an issue anymore, that we're putting people in jail because of marijuana. What if we let this be legal? Well, then what happens? And we're all in this great experiment about it. So I found that very interesting, and I think we're seeing the beginnings of a formulated thesis on how we extricate ourselves from something that has been so deeply conditioned in all of us, and we've accepted as the best possible solution ever, to, well, maybe it's not, and holy crap, what do we do about it? So that's kind of my quick on chapter 5, and there's a lot more I'd love to talk about if people are interested, as well as go deeper into some of the questions that Ken, that you raised, for instance. Sophia, you want to jump in a little bit?
Yeah, so I kind of have 4 major things that I was most excited about. My general impressions was that many parts of chapter 5 was really interesting. I found chapter 6 to be extremely dense isn't even quite the right word. It was just really reliant on other thinkers, and each one of those thinkers has an entire context that is broadened in a way that isn't fully digestible. But I did enjoy it. And so the four things that I've really appreciated have been brought up, especially by Mario and Kim. One of them is the transformation of the gift to the commodity, and the way that shows up as more community-oriented bazaars move to more exchange-oriented and impersonal markets, and then to the shopping mall as like the height of impersonality. And then I also appreciated, as part of chapter 6, the rise of a more egocentric individualism, and how he was able to show the difference between anarchy and the more liberal or libertarian way of understanding our relationship with the state. Because both anarchy and libertarianism have this reluctance to the state and this call for autonomy, but because of the centricity of like the egocentric individualism, libertarians tend to think of liberty as freedom without a kind of deep interconnectedness to everything else. And so I appreciated that how he was able to show that rise. And then a third thing is the way in chapter 5 that he understood the state as existing in some ways where it was completely separate from village life, or what he called society. And then the move towards the state being fully pervasive into society, and how that really shifted in terms of power dynamics because it told people how to conduct their social lives. Whereas before it was just much more of an administrative body and something that was like far away in the capital and didn't have a strong influence on just communal living. And then the fourth thing is what Ken brought up, the inequality of equals, or how it went from like the equality of unequals to the inequality of equals. And I understood that in a little bit of a different way. I kind of connected it. I appreciated his discussion of the equality of unequals, when we recognize diversity, we're able to then support those that have certain handicaps.
You say it much better than him. I like that.
But like, we're able to like recognize that not everyone is on equal footing, and then give them what they need so that they are on equal footing. happening. And then we kind of made this shift, and I love how he brought in the scales of justice, and how Justine has a kerchief over her eyes, so she's blind to the diversity. She's blind to the inequities. And I kind of equated this kind of what he means by inequality of unequals to the way that white people have a habit of being like, I don't see color. You know, and the major critique of being like, I don't see color, even though they think it's like, oh, I treat everyone equal, I don't see color. But when you don't see color, you don't see the discrimination. You don't see the inequities that are in place. And then if you don't see them, we're not able to address them. And so I thought that was a really interesting conversation of justice, that it's justice appearing to be just, but is really even more unjust. And then the fifth thing is just what Mario said. I really, really loved the discussion of oh shoot, it just left my mind after I said it. It'll come back to me. But anyway, so those are my 4 major things. I'd be happy to go deeper in any of them. But it seems like we all brought up a lot of stuff, and these chapters are really dense. So I'm wondering which one is most exciting for you all to kind of dig deeper in, or which ones you didn't quite understand and want to flesh out.
I have a couple of questions that I want to throw into the pot too before we kind of decide what direction we want to go in. Okay. He talked a lot about bureaucracy, and every time that word came up, I thought it felt abstract to me in a certain way. But then I got into a dialogue with some people online, totally different kind of a thing. And what I observed was this issue of objectivity came up. And this fellow that I was dialoguing with was asserting that he was objective. And I felt like, wow, how can you even believe that as a conscious human being, that you have any objectivity at all? And it helped me understand a little bit about what for me is problematic in the state, what we're calling the state now and government, is that there is an implicit objectivity. And to me, that's it's a way that people dominate other people by saying, I'm objective, you're not. And it's a false, it's like the idea that science is objective, and we've sort of identified at this point, I think, I certainly have come to the realization that every scientist has their own filter and their own bias. They may be trying for objectivity, but same thing with media. We figured that out. And now there's almost no bother for the media to pretend that they're objective anymore. They're taking their stance and they're just reporting from that perspective. And it is more complex if we understand that we're all subjective. So that was interesting to me. And my question was, is a free society possible without state features such as delegation of authority? So that was a question that I'm holding. And then I had something I didn't understand that I was thinking maybe y'all would weigh in on. So he said on page 202, to Hobbes and Locke, the delegation of power was restricted by the security of life and its extension through labor into the sanctity of property. Anybody have a clue about that? I was like, what?
Read it again, please.
And
Okay.
Where on the page is it?
Okay, so let me see, 202.
It's the second sentence. It's 3 lines down.
Yeah. So, so I'll read you the sentence before it that starts on the other page because it was a lot. I'm going to read a paragraph. This is from the bottom of 201. The state acquires stability, form, and identity Only when personal loyalties are transmuted into depersonalized institutions, power becomes centralized, and professional custom gives way to law, and governance absorbs administration. But the decisive shift from society to the state occurs with the most supreme political act of all, the delegation of power. It is not insignificant that heated disputes, both theoretically and historically, have revolved around this crucially important act. Social contract theory, from Hobbes to Rousseau, recognized in the delegation of power an almost metaphysical centrality. The social contract itself was seen as an act of personal disempowerment, a conscious surrender by the self of control over the social conditions of life. To Hobbes and Locke, to be sure, the delegation of power was restricted by the security of life, Hobbes, and its extension through labor into the sanctity of property, Locke. I mean, and then he goes on to talk about Rousseau and sovereignty, which I did understand, and that was the piece about England, you know, and how they think they're free, and you know, but it's only at the moment of voting. So I just didn't understand that sentence, and it felt important, maybe.
Yeah, I could try it. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, Ken, you go ahead.
Well,
Let's
the
hear your thoughts before
security of life, delegation of power, I think that's about delegating the power of the state to wage war.
Wage war, and then also meet needs like infrastructural needs like roads and things like that. In Locke and Hobbes' case.
Wait, so the delegation of power was, but what's the restricted by the security of life? What is that?
Sophia, you had a more broad view of it, so why don't you? My sense of it was that the first delegation of power to the state is to wage war to protect the citizens. So security of life.
I understand. Oh. Go ahead, sorry.
And then in the sanctity of property, that the protection of the property, again, it's having police and military so that your property is protected if you own it. But Sophia, I haven't read those authors in so long. I'm sure that's much fresher in your mind, and please expand.
Maybe only a little fresher. It's just college, which was at this point like 9 years ago. But from what I remember, both Hobbes and Locke are addressing what legitimizes the social contract that we make, that kind of it gives up our personal liberation for the sake of the state or the collective. And they kind of have different views on what that social contract looks like, but they both see it as, you know, something we're thrown into, that we do it by just existing in a particular territory that's ruled by a state. And for Hobbes, it's much more, we do it because man is fundamentally selfish. Their human nature is very barbaric and warlike, and by adhering to the social contract of the state, we are protecting ourselves by becoming more civilized. And so the state gives that security of our own life, and there's a restriction in terms of how civilized the state is, and exactly like you were saying, how secure it keeps us in terms of its military force from outsiders. Enables us to continue living. So we're restricted by how secure we are, or how secure the state wants us to be. Whereas in Locke's case, he sees us much more as a blank slate that doesn't have a particular human nature, and we make ourselves, and we make our property through our labor. And so that's why instead of restriction, it's expansion, or extension, is that we have we have the social contract where we're given liberty and personal property through our adherence to state laws, and then we're able to extend that through the value that we create with the property that social contract allows us to have. That's from what I remember.
Okay. Ooh.
Does that make more sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
And then the context before that is super interesting. Especially, I haven't read Kropotkin, but I have hit that the Mutual Aid Society, and I've been excited to read it. But I was more confused about that section, and the bit that I got from it was showing how we went from the state as an administrator to a government, because when it's an administrator, we're still self-governing. Mm-hmm. We're still able to govern ourselves. And then when we delegate that power to the state and we allow them to govern us, we then no longer have that self-governing power. And we've kind of depersonalized ourselves and give our loyalties to this abstract state rather than our like blood ties and community.
Mm-hmm.
I think also he mentions at some point something written by Marx about the Indian villages, mm-hmm. and how these villages even in colonial being part of the colonial British Empire, they had a way of working that was very administrative, as you say, Sophia. And I thought that was an interesting example of a village running itself without the need or immersed in the bigger government of an empire. You know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was something else on page 205 that was, to me, an extension of that. And that was, he talks about how the Athenian system was organized in such a way that it obstructed political professionalism and perpetuated an active citizenry. So that was a key that I felt is something I want to hold that.
I have that starred and underlined too.
Yeah, front and center.
Yeah.
So it's something that came out of. That was on page 205 and at the very top of the page.
Can I give an example from my life about how bureaucracy stopped something from happening? Because I think that might illustrate it. I was involved in a state board for the Oregon Department of Justice for 12 years, and our mission statement was to provide multidisciplinary services to children who were at threat of abuse or exploitation. And we had a situation where the one law school did a big paper saying and outlined a specific need, a gap, and pointed it out as the main gap in the system. And the programs we put on were educating the experienced detectives who were working with this population, said this was a big need. And what we had a situation where someone had actually done a program for 13 years that created a holistic safe house for trafficked children. And we had money to allocate. And basically my take on it, I was amazed that bureaucracy stopped it from happening. Just because people involved wanted to do what they'd already done, and it did advance their little tiny bit of power, there was no reason why my friends were willing to train people for free to duplicate the holistic safe house, which was the main gap in the system. And it was only bureaucracy and nothing else. Not any ill intent, not any ill will. It was just that kept that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll bet we've all seen some examples of that.
I'm sure we have. To me, it was incredibly stark and
Yeah.
horrifying
I'll bet.
about the power of bureaucracy. Yeah. So anyway, okay. Thank you for listening to my little
I'd like to
shtick about that.
Can I add a little something also on that subject, and lighting back to the theme that began, Maxie, with Athenian democracy, which I too somehow grew to appreciate greatly somewhere along the way. And coming down to the American Constitution, which was created, I think, based on somewhat on, Athenian democracy, and then at any rate, there's the sort of view that I think you express, that I'm sorry, I'm losing. I'm trying to combine too many ideas. There is built into the Constitution the possibility of correcting, is what I'm trying to say. It was created by these genius thinkers who recognized that many things could arise where a power could be taken by a leader, such as a king, which they were trying to get away from. And so they created connections. So whereas it seems like people only can function when they vote in this democracy, I disagree with this completely, because I have seen so many experiences where the people have, when pushed all the way to shove, revolted within the system. As last night somebody was referring to how Watergate finally caught Nixon. It was only when the people refused to accept what had come out of the reports, the Watergate report, and demanded further, as now they're trying to say this could happen too. We're in a critical moment in this country where this report from Mueller could be blindsided. We could be blindsided and never see it. And the prediction by those who have seen systems work before, both those in government and party, and those who have lived through Watergate and other experiences, that people will express themselves and they will not be able to blind it.
Right.
I've also had a personal experience of working on a board, a city board, as you have, Ken, on a state board, and was involved in a struggle against the city, the state, and the federal government. And it was a long and difficult struggle, which we lost the first part of, but eventually managed to educate a part of the bureaucracy that should have been able to prevent this from happening in the first place, a huge piece, which was the Landmarks Commission, and to change the law over a period of maybe 6 or 8 years, so that no further theaters were ever torn down. So in this personal experience, I guess I'm an optimist in that the system people have to be involved though. They have to not say, I can't do it. It does take saying, I got to get into this and participate in it, and I can't. And you certainly have, with so many young women getting into Congress this year, a proof of that. It's changing. The system permits change. And so that's one.
Yeah, I think that's that connects to me to what he was talking about, direct action too.
I was just gonna say.
Yeah, because
yeah,
direct action,
or what the relationship is between direct action and direct democracy.
Right, but that they're in our, like for instance, in the American democracy that we have in our government, it is written in there that we have a right and an obligation to change whatever doesn't work in here. If it's not a government for the people, by the people, right? And all of that. So one of the things that was interesting though, is that because we have this giant bureaucracy in this state, there are some things that have made their way into this thing that's super wormy, right? That it's conditioned the psyche to say, I can't do that, and I don't. And also, if people are enslaved economically such that they can't take a day off of work to go stand in the streets and make a statement like that, because we don't really have an effective conversation between us and our president, for instance. Once he's elected, he doesn't listen to what we have to say unless we take to the streets, right? So, or go out and visit all those Congress people in their offices. It takes time. So if you have a population that's 98% so busy that they can't even think straight, how do they get out and force that communication to happen with the elected representatives? Well, direct action is the way. We've come to believe, as Bookchin says, that direct action is like just protesting in the street. It's like some kind of, how does he put it? Somebody might help me. I know I took some notes, but I don't know if I can access them. But he kind of had a wonderful way of describing how direct action is, civil disobedience. And it sort of sits in a corner like just those out there hippie people or something are doing that. Whereas direct action is a very important
on page 206, there's a bunch about direct action. Direct action could be turned into a permanent process,
right?
Permanent revolution, not merely a series of episodic acts. It could be shown that direct action as a form of self-administration serves to stabilize society, not to reduce it to chaotic shambles. The state would be placed in the dock of history as a force for violence and domination. Beautiful vision.
Yeah. So I agree with you in some ways, Mom, about where the Constitution leaves room. I just think it needs to be a lot easier for people to engage. And because the economy has such a stranglehold on people right now, it's very difficult for people to get out there. And so it's retirees, it's young people who aren't yet plugged into the system, it's people who are outside of the system, of the economic system, somewhat marginalized, who tend to be the first ones engaging at this level. And then it leaves a huge percentage of householders, people, family, parents.
They can't even get off work to vote in some places.
Exactly.
And we haven't made a national holiday of a voting day. It's a radical thing for the Democrats to even consider it, which I think is a lovely step. But
it's a wonderful step.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I mean, who thought of it? The day, of course, it should be instead of a holiday on some superfluous day. To vote should be the day that everybody has off. It's a great idea.
Right.
I guess I'm such an optimist, though, in some way, because I see that and I see the children. The children are leading revolutions today.
Yes.
Because they're forced to, like you said. Yeah.
Well, they're doing it because they are, it's part of the fact that everybody can see what's going on instantly today.
Yeah.
And so worked in, the terrible stuff that's come out of the internet of the spread of violence, the spread of nastiness, the spread of stupidity, as by this president. But on the other hand, it has also educated, made people instantly aware, including the young people.
Well, I think it's
important
to remember that the young people also have the most stake in these things. Like, especially when it comes to climate change, like, this is our future will still be alive when it's no longer easy to get food. And so, you know, it's one of those things where people keep putting it off, and I think partly it's because they don't have a personal stake in how things turned out. And so that's also relevant in direct action, is this thing directly affecting you? And your work in theaters was something that you had a personal stake in, you know. And so when we're able to organize ourselves around like common purpose and common stake, direct action becomes a lot easier, because I'm not organizing for someone else's life or freedoms, but my own as interrelate with everyone else's.
I guess it's always like that. I mean, even the crappy stuff, when Trump is doing all the terrible things he's doing it because he stands to benefit from it. Everything he does is to make money for his family and himself.
Yep. Yeah. And the children also, again, the children represent a segment of society that isn't yet controlled by the economy. They have time. They have the most time. And their thinking is the most free of the shoulds and the got tos, and that conditioning hasn't dropped in yet. You know, in our modern society, the conditioning of the economy and the economic, the needs of the economy, that to keep that generating and sustaining the economy, happens when we get out of school. So it's either at the end of high school or the end of college, you know, somewhere around there. But it's the young ones who have their minds are freed up and they're getting all this information. And so it makes good sense that we're hearing from them now. I'm grateful, because then the rest of us can go, oh my God, we're not doing our job. We're not doing enough, because they're saying it now. And it's interesting. It's an interesting dynamic.
May I propose of conversation? Just in some of the time we have left, it might be selfish, but I'd love to talk a little bit more about the transition between the transformation of the gift to the commodity. And I'm looking particularly on page 209. So this is the last long sentence of the second paragraph. It says, to buy cheaply and to sell dearly places the parties involved in the exchange process in an inherently antagonistic posture. They are potential rivals for each other's goods. The commodity, as distinguished from the gift, which is meant to create alliances, foster association, and consolidate sociality, leads to rivalry, disassociation, and asociality. And then I'm going to skip a sentence. Or the second half of this next sentence says, society itself had long buffered exchange with a social etiquette of its own, one that still lingers on in the vestigial face-to-face archaic marketplace of the bazaar. I really appreciated that, because I'm an aspiring object peddler today. But I would love to hear some experiences for each of your lives where you felt like when you were exchanging goods or trading something, it had less of a quality of like impersonal exchange and more of like establishing a long-term relationship and having a more social character to it. And whether or not we even do experience that in our lives outside of like birthday gifts, although birthday gifts could you know, be relevant if it was creating a long-term relationship.
I have an experience of that, and I really appreciate your question. And this piece was very relevant to me. And I want to just add, before you started reading, if I may, by the middle of the present century, large-scale market operations had colonized every aspect of social and personal life. The buyer-seller relationship, a relationship that lies at the very core of the market, became the all-pervasive substitute for human relations at the most molecular level of social, indeed personal life. When I was young and I grew up in the city, we did all this, you know, you go to the store and you buy stuff, and you go to the supermarket, and we barely even said hello to the cashier, is my memory. Like, I grew up learning to, like, we were just not even connecting. I grew up in a city with lots of population, and people weren't very, you just walked by so many people all the time. You just, even in the elevator, people would come in and you just kind of look down and try and keep your own space. And I mean, I've evolved to a place where I try to make contact when I'm engaging with people, whether it's around commerce or anything else. And there is, of course, a limit as to how much bandwidth we have. But when I first went to the Oregon Country Fair back in the 80s, this was the first time I'd ever been anywhere, maybe besides Mexico, where everything I bought was made by the people who were selling it. Well, every engagement was a personal engagement. People were connected to what they were selling. There was a history. There was labor. There was love. So there were questions asked. It wasn't like going and buying chicken that you can't even recognize as an animal that's cut off the bone in a plastic and styrofoam from somebody who doesn't, maybe they don't even eat chicken, you know, let alone where does the chicken come from? I don't know. Now we're more attuned to that, a little bit more attuned to that, because we're coming back around, let's say back to the garden that we were expelled from, right? He talks about that in there. So that was transformational for me, to be in a marketplace, in a bazaar, where every look translated into a conversation of acknowledgement, of quality and connection. And it opened my heart as a young person in my early 20s. So now life is much more like that, and I live that more, you know, I've like internalized that in some way. But thank you for asking that question. Anyone else?
No, I was thinking that what you describe as your experience in Mexico is really fantastic. And in a way, we are trying to do something similar with the farmers markets here,
right,
where you can go and you can buy directly from the people that are growing the vegetables or making the bread or whatever they are selling. And it's such a fantastic, different way of doing your shopping than going to a Safeway or and they're local companies. You know, we are more and more aware of this lack of humanity in the way we do our transactions in this modern world. And many companies, small local companies, are trying to bring, I'm hopeful that the young generation and the access to more information that the internet provides us with, you know, like what we are doing here. You know, we're having a person in New York, one in Napa, one in Oregon. So it's a way to become aware and create different ways of organizing and our life and our interaction with the modern society, with the modern, you know, where we privilege, we try to buy from local producers, or, you know, we try to buy from local markets rather than chains that are all over the nation. You know, I am lucky, I have Oliver's Market here, and the Oliver's Market is fantastic. It's owned by their employees. It's local. They have or community market in Santa Rosa. They are also a co-op, and people are becoming more and more aware of the importance of shopping in those places, even if you if you buy products that are coming from far away. You know, okay, it's better to buy it from them than from Whole Foods or Safeway. You know, so I'm very hopeful that we are learning, and we are learning fast, because the young generation doesn't have any choice. We have to deal with climate change, and that's the most important challenge in front of us. If we don't deal with climate change properly, we are doomed. There's no more worries about farmers markets or ways of production, because the whole planet is going to suffer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I heard two things in that I also really appreciated that he brought up later, which was one, the turning away from what he calls the sacredness of the very goods that are meant to support life itself.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other aspect was the appreciation of the artisanship or the labor that went into the wares. And those two aspects, to me, are really important as understanding objects as gifts and exchanging as gifts, because it really holds that kind of power and sacredness for them, instead of it being this like deeply impersonal, just like thing to use, which is problematic, me even saying that, since of the whole like usufruct concept that he uses earlier about the use of it being most important. But I think that there's a way of using something that's standing in relationship to it, of appreciation, rather than using it and exploiting it and extracting from it. And for me, as someone who studies alternative economics, it's important to be able to see economics in that way, and not just as this dirty thing. So yeah, I appreciate you guys sharing your personal experiences of that shift in thought in relation to objects.
Yeah, something struck me also about the gift, when you talk about more organic society, I think, and that term, that expression that he had about the sacred, well, how did it go? This, I don't know, you just referred to it, Mario, I think, or Ken, somebody did. In any case, I think that there's a way in which the nature itself is considered a gift, so that those sacred elements, those elements of life, the sacred aspects of life, those products of life, I think he called them products or something, sacred products of life, I read as the elements, like the water, right? The earth, the air, these elements that in modern life are sort of invisible. They're practically invisible. It's like you turn on your tap and out comes the water, and you don't think twice about it, maybe, you know. But in reality, as our air quality and our water quality and access to water for some, you know, is impaired, suddenly we have an awareness that, oh my goodness, you know, there's an issue with water that could affect me. It's not just those people in the desert, but maybe my water isn't the cleanest. Maybe my water is making me sick. Then what happens? And these elements, these aspects of life, to the original like organic society, are gifts of nature. Whether you want to call it gifts of God or not, gifts of nature. It's part of the inherent gift of being alive. We have access to them. They're available, and they sustain and regenerate life. And without them, we don't have it. So to me, that he doesn't get specific into those elements, but I read that into this thread of the gift to the commodity. When I was growing up, nobody bought water in the US. Now we're buying water. Why? Because we recognize that clean water isn't always available. That's huge. And yet it's happened so slowly that it's been almost invisible. So water is a commodity now.
Air is a commodity in some polluted places in Japan where there's oxygen stations.
Mm.
And in certain areas, people are wearing masks.
I see that increasingly. Now, there's also soil is becoming a commodity, right? People buy good soil because we have so depleted our soil. And even soil-based organisms, people buy to consume them, to eat them, because we don't have the organisms, the life, the healthy bacteria that we need anymore in our food supply. So this has all become commodified. And so how do we go back to recognizing the gift within all that?
I just have to qualify that a little bit, because I'm wondering if a great deal of the water commodification.
Let me check and I'll call you back. I'm in the middle of a meeting right now. I'll call you back.
Hold on one second.
Yes.
Yeah. Go ahead. I've muted him.
I was just saying that I wonder if more of the water commodity, the bottled water issue. I mean, I know in certain areas, for example, when I was a child and came from New York to Los Angeles, people had to buy their water because the water was not pure in Los Angeles. So everybody had a tank, what do you call those things, and poured their water from the tank of water, which got delivered. I mean, you just didn't drink it from the sink, whereas New York has always had wonderful water and still does. It's because it's straight down from the mountains and it comes into reservoirs and comes into the city, unless the local rusty pipes, old pipes have damaged it somewhat. But so I wonder if the bottling of the water and the prevalence of it is because, smart entrepreneur realized, wow, it's handy for people to carry it, and they go to and in the gyms and with the, different lifestyle, just as the coffee, the prevalence of 17 coffee places in one block it's become something that somebody discovered a mint could be made from this and created it. It's not only the loss of water safety, that I think has created the bottled water. It's very handy. I mean, I carry bottled water because it's also good to have water available all the time. And if you're just reliant on going into a store to get a glass of water, so it makes sense, but it's not necessarily because the water is bad always.
Well, I'm going to do a little plug, a little health jot here, because within city water, the water supplies, municipal water supplies are chlorinated and often fluoridated, and those to manage some bacteria for large populations. And those chemicals are known to be endocrine disruptors. Which means that they scramble the signals that hormones in our bodies send. And we are seeing epidemics of hormone dysregulation in the population. So those people who know that that's the case are trying to find water that's clean, but hasn't been poisoned by these chemicals that our bodies just can't handle too much of. So that's just my health perspective that maybe not everybody knows about. So I'm just throwing it out there. So yes, what you're also speaking to, there's health reasons, but there's also the economy. And so what I hear you speaking about is like, when I was a kid, like 40 years ago, a cup of coffee was 35 cents anywhere you went. And in California, you got an endless bottomless cup for the same price. And then Starbucks came along and realized that they could charge $2.50. Now it's $4 or $5 or $6 for coffee. But it's the economy and the demands of the incessant work that needs to happen that this coffee is fueling. It's become ubiquitous, and it's created an addiction in the mass population because there's no way to keep up. Whereas people in a natural environment don't need that. They're on cyclical rhythms. They take breaks in their day. They eat without being on the run and multitasking. Things work differently. And so they have vitality that comes from that's a natural vitality that we in the cities and in this economic wheel cannot possibly keep up with. The human body can't do it. So this is something that I feel he's speaking about, that some of those threads, that we can start to connect those dots between why is he talking about organic society? Why is he talking about nature? Why? Because we've become isolated from our own nature. We don't spend time in nature. Nature's nourishing. Nature teaches us to slow down, to have periods of activity and periods of rest. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So we're yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying maybe we could talk about what to do for next week.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to suggest that we skip some chapters because we have 2 meetings left. I think that for the last meeting, it'd be really good to do both the last chapter, the ecology.
Not hearing you.
Hold on one sec. Mario, I'm going to mute you for a second while you're moving around. Go ahead.
I think that for the last meeting, it'd be really good to have read the Ecological Society and the epilogue. So for next week, because the next 3 chapters are so long, we might just need to choose one of them.
Mm-hmm.
So there's From Saints to Sellers, which from what I can see seems pretty skippable. And then, I'm sorry, there's The Legacy of Freedom. There's 4 chapters. There's The Legacy of Freedom, which I think is also skippable, and Saints to Sellers, which I think is skippable. And then I would have us all choose between The Social Matrix of Technology and The Ambiguities of Freedom for next week. And then I think for the final.
What about the 2 images of technologies? Did you say?
Oh, yeah. So there's 5 chapters.
Oh yeah. Okay, wait. Let's go through. Let's see what they're called again. I want to get I think we're onto something. What if we each pick a different chapter? Is that what do you think about that? And then we can each kind of represent what we've read. That's an idea. If we've got 5 chapters, how many of us? 1, 2, 3. There are 5 of us. Then
That's a great idea.
It puts a bit of burden on everyone to get through a chapter more or less,
Right. So yeah, there's 5 for next week, and then for the final week, we all read the last chapter
and the epilogue. Mm-hmm.
I'd be happy to take on The Social Matrix of Technology.
Okay, great.
And
Sophia.
then I'll if I'm able, will at least skim and do a second read of all of them to at least support whoever is presenting a chapter.
I missed the second part of what you just said.
Oh, just that if I'm able, I will do a good read of each of the chapters so that I can support whoever is presenting them.
Okay.
Well, since I haven't read any of these final 5 chapters, I would take any of them. So
I'd like to read The Ambiguities of Freedom, I think.
Okay.
I'll focus on that. I'll also try and skim the others a little bit too, but
So what's left is the 2 images of technologies.
Mm-hmm.
From Saints to Sellers and the Legacy of Freedom.
Oh, so you're going back to those, which you were going to
Yeah, those 3 are still available. And it looks like the Legacy of Freedom is very history based. So if anyone's history oriented, I would pick that.
Is it more, as far as you're concerned, of what we've been reading, which was also history of groups? This is history of freedom. The legacy of freedom. All right, let me do that then.
Great.
How,
And then what about you, Mario? Well, I got to unmute you. Sorry about that. Does one appeal to you more than the other, from Saints to Sellers, or 2 images of technology?
Which are the ones available?
From Saints to Sellers and the 2 images of technology.
2 images of technology. Okay. Either one. You pick for me. 2 images of technology I will choose.
Okay.
Do you want to do From Saints to Sellers, Ken?
Sure.
Cool.
Great.
Or Ken, is the same for me if you want the other?
No, it's fine. One is the same as the other to me. I haven't read either one.
Okay. All right.
Oh, great. We have a plan of action. How fun.
Hey, fantastic.
All right, everyone. This has been
Thank
great.
you so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Have a good week, everybody.
Yeah.
You too. Have a nice week.
bye.
Bye.